The moment Cain kicked open the heavy oak door, a howling, icy wind, laced with sleet, rushed in. The dim oil lamp by the door went out with a pop, and the entire hall was plunged into gloomy silence. Before his wolf had a chance to adjust to the darkness, he heard that voice, a young, soft, childlike voice coming from the corner of the staircase. "Mommy, is that Daddy coming home?" The words felt like a rusty knife, stabbing him deep in the chest. Cain froze in his tracks. The frost on his eyelashes melted into water, trickling down the corners of his eyes. He couldn't tell if it was snowmelt or something else. Then he heard her reply. The voice was all too familiar. It was Selena's. But the emotion within it was so foreign, it filled him with dread. No hatred, no resentment, not even a shred of anticipation waiting to be ignited. She merely gave a soft laugh, a sound as light as a feather landing on the snow, so faint it was almost inaudible. "No, sweetheart. That's not Daddy, it's just someone who forgot to come home." Someone who forgot to go home. Cain felt as if an invisible hand were clenching his throat. He was the king of the north, the alpha of the Dark Moon tribe, commanding 30,000 wolf warriors. A single command from him could make mountains and rivers change color. Yet at this moment, he didn't even have the courage to take a single step. He had spent 3 long years waging war across the land, seizing territory, and slaughtering enemies. He had believed he was expanding the tribe's domain. But as he stood in the great hall of his own castle, still clutching a battle, axe stained with the blood of his foes, he realized for the first time he couldn't even conquer his own home. The fire in the hearth was rekindled by an aide standing beside him, who silently walked over and struck a spark with a flint. The flames leapt to life, pulling the entire hall out of the darkness. Then Cain saw it. He saw the blankets that hadn't been there before he left, the pile of hand-carved wooden toys in the corner, a tiny wooden horse lying on its side on the floor, with a few pine cones scattered nearby. He saw a clay pot on the long table, filled not with the black wolfsbane that symbolized the Dark Moon clan, but with a large bunch of golden, dried wheat ears, something found only in Selena's homeland, symbolizing harvest and peace. He also noticed a tapestry hanging on the wall. The stitches were crooked, yet it bore a line of striking red letters. Home isn't about waiting for someone to return. It's about someone lighting the lamp. Cain's fingertips trembled. He recalled every detail of the day 3 years ago when he had abandoned her. It had been snowing heavily that day as well. She stood at the castle gate, her belly already swollen, wrapped in a cloak washed white, her lips frozen blue. She had even tried to reach out and grab the reins of his horse, a faint glimmer of hope flickering in her eyes. "Cain, I beg you, at least give the child a name, an identity." And how had he answered? He'd looked down on her as if she were a burden thrust upon him, coldly snapping, "We'll talk when I return if you're lucky enough to live that long." Then he spurred his horse away, the wind and snow behind him sweeping up her cries and swallowing them in seconds. For the 1,000+ days and nights that followed, he deliberately pushed her from his mind. He told himself that the timid girl had either died or fled back to her dilapidated tribe. He had even mocked her with others at banquets, saying that his so-called bride was likely the sort who would cry at the sight of a mouse. But he never imagined that the girl who feared even mice would, in such a desperate situation, transform the stone tomb he had left behind, bit by bit, into a home that made him want to kneel and weep. His aide dared not speak. All the bodyguards felt the terrifying emotional surge erupting from the alpha. Not anger, but something deeper, darker, and more desperate than anger. Cain spun around abruptly, grabbed his confidant by the shoulders, and growled in a low voice. For these past 3 years, no one helped her. How did she survive? Where's the money? Where's the food? Who fought by her side? He was nearly roaring, his voice laced with a hint of fear he didn't even want to admit to himself. He feared hearing a name, a man's name, feared that another stood by her side, filling the place he should never have left vacant. But his confidant looked at him with an incredibly complex expression and shook his head slowly. "Your Highness, there was no one else, only her. And your son, she alone turned this ruin into your home." Cain released his grip and took a step back, as if all his strength had been drained from him. He looked up at the figure at the top of the stairs. Selena had appeared there at some point, wearing a coarse linen dress, her hair casually tied at the nape of her neck, with a few strands falling beside her cheeks, holding the hand of a little boy just over 2 years old. The boy had black hair exactly like his own, yet his eyes were a clear brown, just like hers. Those eyes were fixed on him, without curiosity, without warmth, only with a child's characteristic wariness and detachment. Selena didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't cry, and didn't smile. She simply placed one hand gently on the child's shoulder, and in that maddeningly calm tone, repeated her earlier words. One by one, "You're back, but we don't need you anymore." The firewood in the hearth suddenly burst with a loud crack, sending sparks flying like countless shards of starlight. Cain stood there, feeling as though a string within his heart had snapped in that very instant. It turned out that he had spent 3 years conquering half a continent, yet he had never conquered this woman's heart. And she had spent 3 years doing just one thing, teaching herself that she no longer needed him. He thought he had returned to save the fragile woman who was waiting for him to save her, but he didn't realize that he was the one who had no home. His knees began to buckle, and a voice inside him screamed frantically, "This is not the outcome I wanted." He opened his mouth to speak, but his throat felt as if it were filled with scalding sand, for he suddenly realized that the most foolish thing he had ever done in his life was not losing a battle, but 3 years ago, when he had cast his own moon into the deepest darkness with his own hands, and now the moon shone with its own light, no longer needing his sun. Let's rewind 4 years. Back then, Selena didn't even dare to look up when standing before Cain. She came from a small, nearly forgotten tribe on the border, the Silverleaf tribe, a tribe so small that the Wolf clan hadn't even bothered to mark it on their maps. Her father had practically sent her here as a tribute, in exchange for the Dark Moon tribe's protection. She remembered the day she left. Her father didn't even glance at her, merely wringing his hands and smiling apologetically at the Dark Moon envoy, saying, "This girl is obedient. She won't cause you any trouble." She was indeed obedient. So obedient, it made one want to crush her to pieces and throw her away. On the very first day she was brought to the castle, Cain didn't even show up for the wedding. In his place, his trusted aide, Decamp, Ed performed the blood oath ceremony. Ed stood before the altar, looking awkward, holding a black obsidian dagger, a symbol of the Alpha's authority, and whispered to her, "His Highness, he's gone to war. He left in a hurry." Selena said nothing. She simply lowered her head to look at the old boots she'd worn all the way from her hometown, their toes caked in mud, a stark contrast to the priceless bearskin rug before the altar. She herself was those old boots, tossed into a sea of luxury that didn't belong to her, her very existence seeming like an eyesore. 3 months later, Cain returned. It was the first time she had truly seen him. He was much taller than she had imagined, with black hair falling to his shoulders and a cold, stern look between his brows and eyes, a look forged by years of battle. Clad in black iron armor, and with the great sword, Dark Moon's Fang, which struck terror into the hearts of all the North, hanging at his waist, he entered the hall, and all the servants knelt. Selena knelt too, her head bowed lower than anyone else's, her forehead nearly touching the floor. She thought this was the custom. She believed that if she were humble and obedient enough, she could carve out a small corner for herself to survive in this man's world. But when Cain walked past her, he didn't pause for even half a second. "Is this the one they sent?" he asked Ed without turning his head, as he unfastened his blood-stained cloak and tossed it to a servant. His tone was as if he were asking whether a stray cat or a mouse had wandered into the kitchen that day. "Yes, Your Highness, Selena of the Silverleaf tribe," Ed said in a hushed voice. "The elders say that, according to an ancient prophecy, her bloodline might—" "Enough." Kane cut him off, his voice as cold as an ice blade. "I don't believe in any prophecies. Have her taken to the North Tower. Don't let her show her face in my presence." That was the first exchange between them. Or rather, it didn't even deserve to be called a conversation. From start to finish, Kane never once looked her in the eye. And she, from start to finish, didn't dare utter a single sound. She was taken to the North Tower, the most dilapidated, most remote corner of the entire castle. The windows in her room didn't close properly, and at night the cold wind poured in, piercing her bones like countless needles. Wrapped in a thin blanket, she curled up on the hard wooden bed, listening to the clamor of the banquet drifting from the distant hall where Kane was drinking and reveling with his generals. She could smell the aroma of roasted meat and the sweetness of mead, yet no one thought to send her a single bite. Her stomach growled, mingling with the sound of wind and snow outside the window, like a dirge no one heard. But Selena didn't cry. She had known since childhood that crying was useless. Crying wouldn't stop her father from beating her. It wouldn't stop the children in the tribe from throwing stones at her, and it certainly wouldn't make this Alpha, who treated her as if she were invisible, give her a second glance. She simply clenched the corner of the blanket tightly and told herself, "You must survive. Only by staying alive will you have a chance to prove that you are worthy of being seen." Then, it happened. It was her 5th month at the castle. She discovered she was pregnant. She didn't know how to describe the feeling in that moment. It wasn't joy, nor was it fear, but a strange warmth welling up from the very depths of her heart. This child was the first thing she had truly called her own in this cold stone cage. She thought that even if Kane continued to treat her as nothing, at least this child was his flesh and blood. Surely he would care just a little. She waited 3 days, then finally mustered the courage to walk to Kane's door. One early morning, she stood there for nearly half an hour, the cold wind freezing her hands and feet stiff, before she raised her hand and knocked 3 times with all her strength. The door opened. Kane stood inside, bare-chested with a cloth draped over his shoulder. He had clearly just finished fencing practice, steam rising from his body. He looked down at her. She was only as tall as his shoulder, and furrowed his brow. "What do you want?" Selena took a deep breath, her voice so soft it was almost drowned out by her own heartbeat. I'm carrying your child." The air froze completely in that instant. Kane's expression shifted several times in the blink of an eye. First came shock, then doubt, and finally all emotion was overshadowed by deep loathing. He reached out and grabbed her chin with such force that it brought tears to her eyes. This was the first time he had ever touched her, and yet it was under these circumstances. He forced her to look up at him. There was not a shred of warmth in those gray, blue eyes, only the fury of someone who felt betrayed. "You sure know how to pick your moment. I've only been back at the castle for a few days. Are you sure this is mine?" Selena felt as if someone had clenched her heart in a vice. She wanted to explain, to tell him that in the 5 months she'd been at the castle, she'd only seen him once. That time she'd accidentally bumped into him in the hallway while he was drunk. And without a second thought, he'd shoved her into an empty room next door. It had all happened so fast, so brutally, that he might not even remember it. But the words wouldn't come out. Her lips trembled. Tears streamed down her face, yet she couldn't force a single syllable from her mouth. Kane released his grip and took a step back, as if he'd touched something filthy. He turned away, picked up the decanter on the table, poured himself a glass, took a sip and then said coldly, "I'll have someone look after you until you give birth. If the paternity test proves it's mine, I'll give him a name. As for you," he paused, and the contempt hidden in that silence cut deeper than any words. "You are nothing but an accident. You'd best not delude yourself into thinking this child, will help you climb the social ladder. An accident. That was the sum total of her existence in his eyes. In the months that followed, Selena grew up alone and quietly, like a plant forgotten in a corner. Cain had indeed arranged for someone to care for her, but that was all. He never came to see her again, until that day when the council's prophecy mage paid an unexpected visit, bringing news that shook the entire castle. During a ritual, the prophecy mage had witnessed a vision. The child in Selena's womb would, one day in the future, hold the key to the very survival of the entire wolf clan. Hidden within this child's bloodline lay the only hope of breaking the millennia old curse. That very night, Cain burst into her room. He had drunk heavily, his eyes were bloodshot, and the stench of alcohol mingled with a murderous aura, causing her to instinctively shield her belly and cower in the corner. He grabbed her wrist, yanked her out of bed, and loomed over her growling. "You knew all along. Did you and your damn tribe plan this from the start? To use a child to bind me?" Selena shook her head frantically, tears falling in heavy drops onto the back of his hand. "I don't know. I really don't know anything about any prophecy." He stared at her for a very, very long time, so long that she thought he was going to kill her. But in the end, he simply let go of her abruptly, letting her fall back onto the bed. He walked to the window, turning his back to her, his shoulders like a silent mountain, bearing down on something she would never be able to understand. He remained in that posture for a long time, the snowlight outside casting his silhouette in a particularly lonely glow. Then he spoke, his voice calmer than ever before, yet beneath that calm lay something deeper. "Tomorrow, I will perform the formal blood oath ceremony with you. You will remain in the castle as the princess of the Dark Moon tribe." Selena froze. This was the promise she had waited and longed for so long. Yet when it finally came, she found not a shred of joy in her heart. For as Cain spoke these words, he never once turned to look at her. He was not accepting her, he was merely following the rules of fate. To him, she was still not a person, just an event marked by prophecy that had to be dealt with. The wedding was held hastily the next day. There were no guests, no blessings, no vows. Ed once again served as the witness. His gaze toward Selena was filled with pity, yet he said nothing. Cain ran the obsidian dagger across the palm of his hand. A drop of blood fell into Selena's palm, cold as the snowmelt outside the window. He completed the final rite of the blood oath with a blank expression, then released her hand as if finally shedding a heavy burden. He didn't even stay at the castle for another night. That very afternoon, news of enemy movements reached the northern border. He donned his armor and led his personal guard out. Selena ran after him. The snow was falling heavily. Her skirt dragged through the snow so heavy that every step felt like struggling through a quagmire. She reached the castle gates just as Cain was mounting his horse. She reached out and grabbed his reins. It was the bravest thing she had ever done in her life, and also the most foolish. She tilted her head back, snowflakes settling on her eyelashes. Fighting desperately to keep from shivering, she forced a smile that looked worse than a cry. "Cain, please at least give the child a name, an identity. What is his surname?" Cain sat on his horse, looking down at her from above. The wind and snow whipped his black hair into a wild tangle, and his gaze was colder than the blizzard. "We'll talk when I return." He tugged at the reins, not struggling to free himself from her grasp. He merely gave her a look, one that was enough to make her let go on her own. "If you're lucky enough to live that long." The horse whinnied, and the slush kicked up by its hooves splashed all over her. The cavalry charged past her, their hooves shaking the ground. Selena stood alone in the blinding snow as the dark mass of horsemen receded into the distance, eventually becoming a thin black line on the horizon before being swallowed by the storm. Her fingers remained clenched, frozen crimson, her palm now empty. She didn't know how long she had stood there, perhaps half an hour, perhaps the entire afternoon, until she felt a faint flutter in her womb, like a tiny fish swimming inside her. She lowered her head, pressed her palm against her lower abdomen, and tears finally began to fall one by one onto the snow, leaving small indentations in the ground. But she quickly wiped away her tears and turned to walk back to the castle. The moment the great doors slammed shut behind her, Selena spoke a single sentence to herself, her head bowed. The words were so soft that only she could hear them, yet they carried more weight than anything she had ever said in her life. Selena, starting today, you no longer live for him. You live for yourself, and for this child. She raised her head and glanced at the cold, empty castle. The fire in the hall was nearly out, with only a pile of dark red embers clinging to life. Outside the window, the snow was still falling, and the wind squeezed through the cracks in the walls, making a sound like a whimper. None of this was any different from yesterday. But something inside Selena had changed completely. She wasn't waiting for anyone anymore. That night, she patched the window with a torn corner using old rags, then knelt on the floor and wiped it down with well water that had been freezing for half the day. She fetched the day's leftover firewood from the kitchen and stoked the hearth anew. As the flames flickered to life, they bathed the entire dilapidated room in a warm yellow glow. She stared at the fire for a long time, then poured the bag of gold coins Cain had left her for emergencies onto the floor and counted them one by one. 43 in all. With these 43 gold coins, she would give birth to her child and carry on living in this cold stone cage. She didn't know when Cain would return or if he would return at all, but none of that mattered anymore. What mattered was that she had to survive, and she had to survive in such a way that the man who had treated her as an accident would one day be forced to admit that he had missed out on the one thing he should never have let slip through his fingers in his entire life. Meanwhile, on the battlefield at the frontier thousands of miles away, Cain sat by the campfire, polishing his greatsword. The firelight fell on his face, outlining his chiseled features. Ed, sitting beside him, hesitated for a long time before finally speaking cautiously. "Your Highness, regarding the princess." "Don't call her the princess," Cain interrupted coldly, his hand never stopping its work. Ed fell silent for a moment, then changed his wording. "Regarding Miss Selena, should we send someone back with supplies? The food in the castle storerooms might not last through the winter." Cain didn't answer. His sword stopped midway through its stroke, its blade reflecting his own eyes. Eyes that concealed, deep within, a hint of something he would never admit. He drove the sword hard into the frozen ground at his feet, stood up, and said in a harsh tone, "If she wants to live, she'll find a way. If she doesn't make it, that's her own fate." The words cut to the bone. Yet Ed noticed that Cain lay awake that night. A man who could sleep amidst mountains of corpses and rivers of blood, tossed and turned all night long, until just before dawn, when he finally squeezed a sentence through clenched teeth. The words were as faint as a phantom, but Ed heard them nonetheless. "Don't die. At least don't die before I return." But Cain didn't know that the person he'd always believed would wait for him right where she was. This time she hadn't waited. She'd spent 3 years turning every crack he'd left behind into a wall. And now, if he wanted to cross that wall again, he'd have to be willing to smash his head open. Cain didn't know how he managed to make his way down the stairs. His feet felt as though they were sinking into a swamp. Every step was strangely heavy. Selena's calm gaze from moments ago was still etched in his mind, a gaze he had planted there himself. The coldness with which he had nurtured this woman 3 years ago was now being returned to him, unchanged. "Ed," he called in a low voice. His aide stepped out of the shadows, his face bearing an expression unbecoming of a veteran, hesitation, reluctance, and a hint of long-suppressed anger. "Speak. Tell me exactly how she's lived these past 3 years. Don't hold a single word back from me." Ed took a deep breath and condensed 3 years' worth of reports into a single passage. That first winter, rats ravaged most of the castle's grain reserves. 7 months pregnant, she dug for frozen wild greens in the snow, An old woman tried to help her, but she refused. She said she couldn't afford to owe anyone a favor, because no one would pay it back for her. Cain's fingers clenched violently, his nails digging into his palm, blood dripping through the gaps onto the floor. The following spring, your son was born in the stables. No midwife, no doctor, only her. She used a pair of horse grooming shears to cut the umbilical cord. Later, the child fell ill with a fever that raged for 7 days and nights. She held him in her arms and knelt on the stone floor of the North Tower's attic for 7 full days. The patrol sentry said she was barefoot, reciting an ancient blessing song of the Silverleaf tribe the entire time. Her knees were raw, her voice hoarse from chanting, yet she managed to wrest the child from the grip of death. Cain closed his eyes. The image was seared into his heart like a hot iron. The woman he'd never bothered to look at twice, kneeling on the cold stone floor, propping up a life he'd never intended to care about with her bloodied knees. And the 3rd year. His voice was hoarse and distorted. In the 3rd year, she changed. Ed's Adam's apple bobbed. She stopped hiding in the North Tower, waiting to die. She started patching the walls, cleaning out the cellar, and planting vegetables in the overgrown backyard. The old wolves of the village looked down on her, calling her a discarded piece of trash. But she didn't argue, until one day, a raging wild bear burst into the village. Alone, she stood in front of several children, a pitchfork in hand, and drove the bear back into the woods. From that day on, no one in the domain dared to look down on her. Cain whipped his head around and glared at Ed. Why didn't you tell me any of this? For the first time, Ed's eyes flashed with undisguised anger. His fists clenched so tightly at his sides, they turned white, and though he tried to suppress it, the words still ground out between his teeth. Your Highness, I wrote battle reports every season. I wrote about how she single-handedly held this ruin together, how she transformed from a girl waiting to die into a princess respected by all. But what of your replies? Every time, you only asked how far we'd advanced along the border, only asked where the enemy had retreated to. For 3 years, you never asked a single word about her in your replies. Those words struck Cain like a slap across the face. He opened his mouth, but all the excuses he wanted to offer were stuck in his throat. He could have said he deliberately avoided asking because he hated that prophecy, hated the feeling of being manipulated by fate, and she was the very embodiment of that prophecy. But even he found the thought of saying that repulsive. He hated the prophecy, yet he'd poured all his hatred onto an innocent woman. Just then, footsteps sounded on the stairs. Selena came down holding the child's hand and stopped 3 paces away from him. Neither too close nor too far, exactly the distance between a stranger and an intruder. She tilted her head slightly and glanced at him, her gaze as if appraising a piece of old furniture that hadn't been used in ages. You haven't left yet. Before he could answer, she bent down and whispered to the boy, Leanne, go to the kitchen and get 2 bowls for Mommy. Leanne. What was his last name? Cain's mind exploded with the realization. The child had a first and last name, but who had given him his first name? Whose last name was it? When he rode off on his horse 3 years ago, he hadn't even left the child a name. After the boy ran into the kitchen, Selena turned her gaze back to him. Her eyes finally held emotion, not hatred, not resentment, not even anger. It was something far more terrifying, something he had never seen in anyone's eyes before. Composure. I know what you want to say, she began, her voice as calm as if she were stating a fact that had nothing to do with her. You want to say you're bound by the prophecy, that you had no choice, that you've been suffering these past 3 years. Fine, I've already said it all for you. You don't need to explain. But Cain, she took a step forward, lifting her head to look him straight in the eyes. Her back was straight as a rod. The prophecy says your child holds the key to the wolf clan's survival. It didn't say you had to love me or be kind to me or treat me like a human being. You can hate the prophecy, but you have no reason to treat me that way." Her eyes were red, but there were no tears. She had spent 3 years turning all her tears into something else, something that was now welling up from her eyes. It wasn't resentment, but a heavy, undeniable dignity that no one could ignore. "Where was your no choice when you left me here to die? Where was your prophecy when your child was born in a stable without even a clean cloth to wrap him in? Where were you when Leon was burning to death, and I was on my knees begging every god in the heavens?" She took another step forward, close enough for Cain to smell the faint scent of soapry on her skin and the aroma of wheat from the kitchen. The scent was too clean, so clean it made him feel as though he was covered in blood that could never be washed away. "You don't know what I was praying for in the end, when I was on my knees begging the gods." She smiled, and that smile felt like a knife stabbing into Cain's chest and emerging through his back. She raised a finger to her heart. "I prayed that I would never have to wait for you again, to let me learn to hate you. But then I realized hating you was too exhausting, so I stopped. I just cut you out of my life." Cain staggered slightly. He reached out to touch her face. The first time in his life he truly wanted to touch her, but her hand was faster, gently deflecting his wrist. She didn't use much force, just pushed him away firmly and calmly. "Cain Dark Moon, listen to me." She spoke slowly, her words as clear as the crisp crack of ice breaking. "The prophecy needed a child. I gave birth. You needed a queen to deal with the council. I became one. You needed a clean home waiting for your return. I've tidied it up for you, too." She raised her hand and swept it around the warm hall. "I don't owe you anything. Nothing at all." Cain suddenly grabbed her wrist. This time his movement was too swift and desperate. She hadn't had time to dodge. His hand was trembling. He couldn't control himself. "I don't believe you owe me nothing," he said, looking down at her, his eyes bloodshot, his voice sounding as if it were being torn from the depths of his throat. "Name your price. I'll give you anything you want." Selena looked at him quietly for a very, very long time. Then she gently pried his hand away. He could have gripped her tighter, but he didn't dare. "What do I want?" She lowered her head to look at her wrist, red from his grip, then looked back up at him. A thin film of tears finally welled up in those brown eyes, but they didn't fall. "I want you not to have ridden away 3 years ago. I want someone to have been waiting at the door when Ryan was born. I want God to have answered me when I knelt on the ground begging him, instead of letting me hear the news of your victory from 1,000 miles away." With every word she spoke, Cain's face grew paler. By the end, her voice was as soft as a whisper, yet each word pierced him like a nail, pinning him to the floor. "Cain, even at the height of your wealth, you couldn't give me what I want. Now, what do you have to offer in return?" She turned and walked toward the kitchen. After a few steps, she paused, turned her head, and left him with the silhouette of half her face. "Oh, and you asked earlier what the child's last name is. It's Yinya, Lianyanye. I figured it out later. If I want a name, I can give it myself. When he grows up, I'll tell him, what makes you strong isn't your last name, but the fact that you can stand on your own without needing anyone." Her figure vanished into the kitchen doorway. From inside came the sharp clatter of dishes, followed by Ryan's babyish voice asking, "Mommy, is that uncle still here?" "He's not an uncle. He's a spirit fulfilling a final wish. Once the wish is fulfilled, it's time to go." Cain stood alone in the center of the hall, unable to move. The wolf within him let out a low, mournful howl, the kind only a wolf who has lost its mate would make. He suddenly realized one thing: this woman did not hate him. Hate implies you still care. She had uprooted him from her heart, erasing him along with all her memories of him. The way she looked at him now was as if she were gazing at an old gravestone, destined to crumble away sooner or later. And yet, he realized with sorrow that in the very moment she said, "I've uprooted you," he had truly, completely down to every bone and every drop of blood, fallen in love with her. He unsheathed the great sword Dark Moon's fang from his waist, and leaned it against the corner of the wall. This weapon, a symbol of the Dark Moon's sovereignty, had never left his side in 3 years. But now he had left the sword behind in her castle. Ed approached cautiously. "Your Highness, shall we camp inside the castle tonight, or outside?" Kane cut him off, his gaze sweeping past the window to the barren grassland beyond the castle. His voice deepened, carrying a resolve he had never known before. "If she won't let me in, I won't go in. She kept a lamp burning for me in the North Tower for 3 years. I'll repay her with 3 years of nights spent waiting outside the door." He paused, gazing toward the kitchen. The singing had started up again, an ancient ballad of the Silverleaf tribe, telling of a girl who left her homeland and built a new world for herself in a place where she had nothing. The song flowed like water through the corridor, over the crisscrossing old scars on his body. "It took her 3 years to tear my heart from her," he said softly, each word seeming to be ground out from between his bones. "Then I'll take even longer to plant her heart back in. If 1 year isn't enough, I'll take 3. If 3 aren't enough, I'll take 10. I don't believe there's a place in this world where a heart can't be replanted." Moonlight outside the window blanketed the snow-covered ground. A warm yellow lamp glowed in a window of the North Tower in the distance, like a tiny eye quietly watching over the night. Outside the castle, the tents of the Dark Moon tribe were being pitched one after another, while the King of the North, commander of 30,000 Wolf Clan warriors, sat alone beneath an old oak tree whose branches were bent low by the snow. Leaning his back against the rough bark, he looked up at the lit window. As dawn approached, he saw Selena push open the window and glance out. From such a distance, her expression was indistinct, but her posture was neither searching nor hopeful. It was simply detached, as if she were looking at an old gravestone destined to weather away. Then she drew the curtains. The light went out. Kane reached into his coat and felt a cold silver amulet. He'd found it during the Northern Campaign, among the ruins of a destroyed tribe. It was engraved with the profile of a woman. He'd meant to throw it away, but for some strange reason he'd kept it. Now he knew who that profile resembled. He clenched the amulet in his palm until it grew hot, then leaned against the tree trunk and closed his eyes. Inside the castle, Selena held Ryan, who had been startled awake by a nightmare, gently patting his back. The child rolled over and asked sleepily, "Mommy, why doesn't that man outside go home?" Selena pulled him close, resting her chin against his soft black hair. She was silent for a long time, so long that Ryan thought she wouldn't answer, before she spoke softly, "Because some people have to leave their hearts out in the cold for a while before they can learn how to find their way home." She kissed his forehead and watched the first glimmer of dawn break over the horizon through the slits in the curtains. The snow had stopped. A new day had begun. Kane spent 7 days on the overgrown field outside the castle. Every morning, he woke before dawn, sat beneath the old oak tree, and watched the window of the North Tower. Selena always drew back the curtains first, pushed open the window, and glanced outside at the sky, not at him. She looked at the weather, at the vegetable patch, her gaze as indifferent, as if she were looking at a crooked tree. Kane would have preferred her to hate him. Hate, at least, would have meant he still occupied her thoughts. But the way she looked at him now was no different from how she might look at a little white flower growing at the base of a wall. On the evening of the 7th day, the back door of the kitchen opened. Selena came out carrying a basin of vegetable. Washing water poured it at the base of the wall, and turned to go back inside. He called out to her, his voice hoarse, "I need to talk to you, about Ryan." She stopped, her expression shifting only for a moment when she heard her son's name. Kane said, "Tomorrow is the night of the full moon. According to Dark Moon Clan custom, all of royal blood must enter the sanctuary to receive the elder's blessing. Leanne has never undergone this ritual, Without royal recognition, he will forever be he paused. A bastard. Selena finished for him, her tone as calm as if she were discussing today's weather. I want you to take him there, Cain said, staring into her eyes. Not so that he can be acknowledged by me as a bastard, but so he can walk into the sanctuary with dignity, as his true self, the Dark Moon clan's next heir. And you, as his mother, will stand by his side. Selena was silent for a long time, then gave a soft laugh, tinged with weary resignation. You think spending 7 days here should have moved me? Cain, I don't need your clan to acknowledge me. 3 years ago, I needed it because I thought it would earn your respect. Later I realized respect isn't something others bestow. I spent 3 years earning the respect of the people here. Not because I'm Selena Darkmoon, but because I'm Selena. She spoke with her back straight, the setting sun casting light on the side of her face. Cain recalled what Ed had said, how she'd single-handedly driven a wild bear into the woods with a pitchfork. He believed it now, but Ryan needs this ritual. He lowered his voice, knowing exactly how to persuade her. The prophecy says, your child holds the fate of the Wolf Clan. All the elders and the royal family will be present at the full moon festival. If Ryan receives the moon goddess's blessing, the entire Wolf Clan will know of his existence. This isn't a title, it's a talisman. Her eyes flickered. Just as he'd expected, she could refuse anything, but she wouldn't refuse her son's safety. I'll go, she finally said. But if you have any hidden agenda I don't know about, if anything happens to Ryan, I'll show you just how far a woman with nothing left to lose is willing to go. Just then, the kitchen door opened a crack. Ryan poked his head out, wrapped his arms around his mother's legs, and tilted his head to look at Cain. Mom, why is this uncle sitting outside our house every day? Doesn't he have a home? Selena ruffled his hair and said calmly, He does. He used to have one, but he lost it. Then he can find it again, Ryan said matter-of-factly pointing toward the backyard. Last time I lost my little red ball, I found it right here in the backyard. Cain crouched down to meet the child's gaze. The boy's eyebrows resembled his own, his eyes his mother's, and the tips of his hair bore the distinctive silver, gray hue of the Dark Moon royal house. He said, Some things don't just roll into the backyard, they roll far, far away, and it takes a very, very long time to find them. Lian tilted his head, not quite understanding, but he didn't shy away anymore. The next day at sunset, in the Dark Moon sanctuary, black armored warriors lined both sides of the 99 stone steps, and silver-pink totems on the dome glowed faintly in the flickering light of the fire pits. Hundreds of people packed the great hall, with the 12 elders arrayed on either side. The doors opened, and everyone turned. Selena stood in the doorway. She wasn't wearing her princess's formal gown, but the traditional attire of the Silverleaf tribe, a moonlight-colored long dress with vine motifs embroidered on the hem. Her long hair was braided into a single plait hanging over her chest, woven with dried flowers and silver leaves. Lian wore a small robe of the same color, clutching her finger as he curiously examined the dome. She led her son through hundreds of pairs of eyes and stopped 3 steps away from the moonstone. The chief elder forced a smile. By the mother of moonlight, is this the princess who lived in the North Tower, forgotten by the North? Your Highness has waited 3 years. At last she has returned. A ripple of faint, mocking laughter rippled through the hall. Selena did not look at them, nor did she look at Cain. She released Lian's hand, took a step forward, and spoke in a clear, resonant voice. Selena Silverleaf, accompanied by my son Lian Silverleaf, has come at the invitation of the Dark Moon clan to attend the full moon festival. May the light of the moon goddess protect this hall. She said, Silverleaf, not Dark Moon. She said, invited, not returned. She had come of her own accord, walking in with her own surname, head held high. The chief elder's smile froze. Several female elders exchanged glances. The silver-haired elder nodded slightly. Damien stood in the front row, a meaningful curve tugging at the corner of his mouth. Cain watched Selena stand before the moonstone, silver blue light flowing from its surface onto the hem of her skirt, the vine totem seeming to come alive as it rippled. Suddenly, his eyes stung with tears. He had spent 3 years crossing the entire Northlands, defeating countless enemies, only to discover in the end that the moon he sought had been shining all along from the window of the North Tower in his own home. He stepped forward, positioning himself between her and the moonstone. In front of the 12 elders, the entire royal family, and hundreds of warriors, he turned toward Selena and dropped to one knee. The hall fell deathly silent. The king of the Dark Moon clan kneels only before the moon goddess and the ancestors. Yet now he was kneeling before a woman he had abandoned 3 years ago. He looked up at her. Selena Silverleaf, in the name of the Dark Moon clan chieftain, I ask Selena of the Silverleaf tribe to allow her son, Leon Silverleaf, to receive the blessing of the full moon, not in the name of a gift I bestow, but in the name of the right that is already his. He glanced at Leon, then back at her. You gave this child his name, you gave him his surname, and you snatched his life from the jaws of death. His honor and dignity belong to his mother. They are not charity from anyone else. Selena's eyelashes fluttered just once, but it was enough.